The Pacific War was not fought in the open sunlight of victory, but in shadows of secrecy. Beneath every headline, triumph, lay classified reports of loss, miscalculation, and human endurance seldom acknowledged. Newly examined naval records reveal a struggle shaped as much by logistics and intelligence failures as by courage and firepower. Let's uncover the 10 facts the U.S. Navy never fully publicized. 1. The myth of Midway's perfect intelligence. The story of the Battle of Midway has been retold for more than 80 years as a triumph of American brilliance, a moment when code breakers and commanders worked in perfect harmony to outthink the Japanese fleet. The legend insists that U.S. intelligence knew the enemy's plan in exact detail, that the carriers were perfectly placed, and that victory was inevitable. Yet the reality preserved in naval records and post-war assessments reveals a battle balanced on guesswork, partial information, and chance. In the spring of 1942, American cryptanalysts had indeed penetrated parts of the Japanese Navy's operational code, known as JN-25, but the picture it produced was far from complete. The intelligence that reached Admiral Nimitz was fragmentary: snippets of intercepted messages, fragments of weather reports, and ambiguous references to a target designated AF. Analysts believed this meant Midway, but proof came only through a ruse: a false radio broadcast from the island reporting a water shortage, designed to elicit a confirming response from Japan. Even then, the United States had no clear knowledge of how many Japanese carriers were committed, how their attack groups were structured, or when precisely they would strike. Nimitz decided to gamble on incomplete information, positioning his carriers north and east of Midway in a defensive arc. When the Japanese fleet approached on June 4th, the sequence of events that followed owed as much to miscommunication and timing as to foresight. American torpedo bombers attacked first and were annihilated. Nearly every plane was destroyed without scoring a hit. But their sacrifice distracted Japanese fighters and forced Admiral Nagumo's carriers to rearm aircraft on their decks, creating a moment of vulnerability. When dive bombers from the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown arrived minutes later, they found the enemy decks crowded with fueled aircraft and exposed ordnance. In 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were ablaze. The victory was real but fragile. One change in timing, one delayed scout plane, or one different decision by Nagumo could have reversed the outcome entirely. The myth of perfect intelligence was convenient for wartime morale, projecting an image of technological supremacy and certainty in a war filled with fear and chaos. In truth, Midway demonstrated not omniscience, but disciplined intuition, the courage to act on imperfect information. It was not a chess game won by code breakers alone, but a desperate calculation in which preparation, error, and chance converged. Understanding this reality restores Midway to its true proportions, not a story of flawless intelligence, but a reminder that in war, even victory rests on uncertainty. 2. The illusion of smooth island hopping. The image of the U.S. Navy's island hopping campaign across the Pacific endures as a tale of steady progress, a string of quick amphibious assaults carried out with mechanical precision. Maps in wartime newsreels showed a confident arrow pushing westward across the ocean, each island captured cleanly before the next was targeted. But the campaign was not a series of effortless leaps. It was a prolonged ordeal of logistics, exhaustion, and adaptation. Every island assault was a massive engineering operation undertaken in hostile, unforgiving environments. Guadalcanal, the first major test, exposed how unprepared American forces truly were. Supplies ran short within days, disease decimated the troops, and control of the surrounding sea changed hands repeatedly as Japanese naval forces struck at night. Later landings at Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu showed how each new island became a fortress rather than a stepping stone. Beaches were mined and fortified, airfields were surrounded by caves, and artillery was concealed in coral bunkers. On Tarawa, Marines found that tides and reefs stranded landing craft hundreds of yards from shore, forcing men to wade under heavy fire. Even after an island was declared secure, the real battle began. Seabees and engineers transformed wrecked beaches into airfields, built docks from coral, and laid thousands of miles of fuel lines under constant attack. Behind the front line, an invisible army of supply ships, repair tenders, oilers, and hospital vessels sustained the advance. The distances were immense. Convoys crossed thousands of miles to deliver ammunition, fuel, and food to isolated atolls. Any disruption, whether submarine attacks or miscommunication, could halt an entire operation. Japanese defenders learned to adapt as well, building deeper tunnels, concentrating artillery in hidden zones, and forcing Americans into costly frontal assaults. Each hop became slower and bloodier than the one before. The popular image of an unbroken advance concealed a campaign fought at the limits of endurance. Victory was measured not just in miles gained, but in the ability to keep men fed, supplied, and functioning across an ocean that swallowed everything. The myth of easy progress obscures the reality that island hopping was not momentum, but attrition. A war fought against geography itself, where logistics determined victory long before bullets did. 3. The hidden war of floating bases. Most wartime accounts describe the U.S. Navy advancing from one secure base to another as though each conquest provided a stable platform for the next. The reality was far more precarious. By 1944, the Navy had advanced so far west that no permanent port could sustain its operations. Traditional naval bases were too distant, too exposed, or too small to handle the vast armada that had become the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The solution was unprecedented: the creation of floating bases, mobile cities of steel that followed the fleet wherever it went. On remote atolls such as Ulithi, Manus, and Eniwetok, entire anchorages were constructed within weeks. Floating dry docks, repair ships, hospital ships, oilers, and ammunition barges turned empty lagoons into fully functioning ports. At Ulithi, hundreds of vessels could anchor simultaneously, receiving fuel, supplies, and maintenance without ever returning to Hawaii or the West Coast. Service Squadron 10, the Mobile Logistics Command, became the hidden backbone of naval warfare. It coordinated food, fuel, spare parts, mail, and manpower for tens of thousands of sailors spread across millions of square miles. Carriers and battleships rotated in and out of these floating bases like clockwork, ensuring constant pressure on Japanese positions. This innovation allowed the U.S. Navy to maintain momentum where geography offered none. Japan never understood how the Americans could operate indefinitely at such distances. Their own fleet, limited by fuel shortages and static bases, could not match the flexibility of a navy sustained at sea. These mobile harbors required enormous coordination. Civil engineers, welders, cooks, and medics working in extreme isolation, but they represented the industrial genius of a nation at war. The myth of nearby bases suggests stability and security, yet the fleet lived on improvisation and ingenuity. Floating bases turned the ocean itself into infrastructure, an idea that changed modern naval warfare. They were invisible to the public, but decisive in outcome. Without them, the island campaign would have stalled in the Central Pacific, and Japan's outer defenses might have held far longer. 4. Submarine warfare was not an easy victory. The image of American submarines prowling the Pacific, sinking Japanese ships at will, has become one of the enduring legends of the war. Wartime newsreels portrayed submariners as silent hunters, slipping through dark waters and striking with unerring precision. In truth, the submarine war was a prolonged, uncertain struggle fought under severe technical and psychological strain. At the start of the conflict, U.S. submarines were crippled by malfunctioning torpedoes, warheads that failed to detonate, depth controls that sent weapons beneath their targets, and guidance systems that malfunctioned in tropical waters. For nearly 2 years, commanders reported repeated failures, only to be told by ordnance officials that no defects existed. Patrols covering thousands of miles often returned with no sinkings to report. Communication was limited, coordination poor, and Japanese anti-submarine tactics steadily improved. Crews operated in extreme conditions, claustrophobic heat, stale air, and constant mechanical risk. Single-depth charge attack could crush a hull or disable a boat hundreds of feet below the surface. When successes finally came in 1944 and 1945, they were the product of attrition and experience, not easy dominance. Submariners learned to hunt convoys, track radio traffic, and strike isolated freighters carrying critical oil and raw materials. Each attack required patience and nerve. Each return to base carried the weight of lost comrades. Roughly 1 out of every 5 American submariners was killed in action, the highest casualty rate of any branch of the U.S. military. The campaign ultimately devastated Japan's merchant fleet and strangled its economy, but its victories were paid for in silence and sacrifice. The myth of effortless underwater supremacy hides a war waged by men who lived and died in confinement, unseen and unheralded. Their struggle was not the clean precision of technology, but the endurance of human beings operating on the edge of survival. 5. The real cost of the island campaign. To many, the Pacific War's island battles appear small compared to the vast armies that clashed in Europe. Maps show limited land areas and short timelines, giving the illusion of quick, decisive operations. Yet the reality was a grinding series of costly assaults that consumed entire divisions and fleets. Each island became a fortress defended to the death. At Tarawa, Marines waded through reefs under machine gun fire, losing thousands in 76 hours. At Saipan, civilians jumped from cliffs rather than surrender. At Iwo Jima, nearly 7,000 Americans were killed in 5 weeks of fighting. At Okinawa, more than 12,000 perished, alongside over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians. The U.S. Navy endured waves of kamikaze attacks that turned the seas into fields of fire. Ships burned by the hundreds, sailors were maimed by shrapnel, and medical units worked day and night on decks slick with blood. Disease, exhaustion, and psychological trauma followed every campaign. The cost extended beyond the battlefield. Each captured island required massive reconstruction. Airfields, ports, fuel depots, and hospitals built from nothing but coral and sand. Supply convoys carried millions of tons of material across thousands of miles, vulnerable to submarines and storms. The industrial weight required to sustain one forward base dwarfed entire European operations. Public memory focused on flags raised and territory gained, but behind each image lay immeasurable human and logistical tolls. The Pacific Campaign was not a clean series of victories, but a slow, grinding war of annihilation that blurred the line between soldier and builder, between combat and endurance. Recognizing its true cost restores balance to how the war is remembered, not as a sequence of heroic advances, but as a monumental test of will and capacity. Every island won was paid for in blood, and every victory carried the shadow of what it consumed. 6. The overstated myth of American naval invulnerability. As the United States advanced across the Pacific, wartime newsreels and post-war histories built an enduring image of an invincible U.S. Navy, unbroken by defeat after Pearl Harbor. Photographs of sleek carriers and vast armadas projected an aura of unstoppable power. In reality, naval operations between 1942 and 1945 were defined by vulnerability, to weather, to attrition, and to the limits of endurance. American fleets did not glide unopposed across the Pacific. They were stretched to breaking point by logistics, fatigue, and the evolving threat of Japanese countermeasures. The myth of invulnerability emerged from necessity. During the war, the U.S. government needed to reassure a home front still haunted by the trauma of December 7, 1941. Sensors controlled imagery of damaged ships, and reports of losses were often delayed or sanitized. Carriers were portrayed as indestructible symbols of national recovery, while the grim realities of naval warfare were hidden behind strategic optimism. Yet the operational record tells a harder truth. Between 1942 and 1945, the U.S. Navy lost over 100 major vessels, including carriers, cruisers, and destroyers, often in sudden and catastrophic engagements. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942, for example, saw the carrier Hornet sunk and Enterprise heavily damaged. Later in 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the U.S. Navy narrowly avoided disaster when Japanese forces lured American carriers north and unleashed a counterattack against vulnerable landing forces. Even outside combat, nature proved relentless. Typhoon Cobra in December 1944 capsized 3 destroyers and killed nearly 800 sailors, while hundreds more were injured or lost overboard. Reports from fleet headquarters describe engines torn from mounts, aircraft swept overboard, and entire decks buckled by wind and wave. These incidents rarely reached the public. They contradicted the image of perfect control and technological dominance. What endured was the illusion of a flawless fleet, moving with certainty toward victory. In truth, the Pacific War was fought on the edge of disaster, sustained only by constant repair, adaptation, and human resilience. Understanding this vulnerability deepens appreciation for those who served not in a mythic armada of steel, but in fragile ships on an unforgiving sea. 7. The misunderstood role of the kamikaze. The word kamikaze has become synonymous with desperation, the image of lone pilots sacrificing themselves against American warships in the final days of the Pacific War. The popular understanding portrays these attacks as the ultimate act of fanaticism, an irrational expression of a defeated nation. Yet the historical reality is more complex. Kamikaze operations were not spontaneous gestures of despair, but calculated responses to a deteriorating military situation. By late 1944, Japan's conventional air power had been decimated, its pilots undertrained, and its fuel reserves exhausted. Facing overwhelming American naval and air superiority, Japanese commanders created the Special Attack Corps as a means to inflict maximum damage with minimal resources. The first organized kamikaze strikes occurred in October 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, when suicide aircraft sank the escort carrier St. Lo and damaged several others. Over the following months, more than 3,800 pilots would die in these missions. The attacks were tactically disruptive, but strategically limited. Less than 20% of kamikaze aircraft reached their targets, and those that did often struck smaller vessels rather than major fleet carriers. U.S. Navy reports described the psychological toll these attacks inflicted. Radar screens glowing with dozens of incoming signals, gunners firing at diving planes until ammunition ran dry, decks turned into infernos of burning fuel. Yet despite the horror, American fleets adapted quickly. Improved radar, combat air patrols, and layered defenses reduced kamikaze effectiveness by 1945. Japanese propaganda had portrayed the attacks as divine intervention, young men transformed into weapons of national salvation. But internal military documents show that morale was uneven and coercion common. Many pilots were barely trained, some were conscripted students. The romanticized image of voluntary sacrifice concealed the disintegration of Japan's military system. For the U.S. Navy, the kamikaze was both a tactical menace and a moral enigma, a reminder that technological superiority could not shield sailors from the human extremes of total war. The legacy of these attacks endures not as a symbol of divine wind, but as evidence of how desperation can be organized into doctrine when nations exhaust every other means of survival. 8. The forgotten reality of war. Logistics. Most accounts of the Pacific War emphasize grand strategy. Fleets clashing, airfields seized, and decisive battles shaping history. What remains largely invisible is the machinery that made every victory possible. Logistics. Behind each operation stood an empire of transport, repair, and supply that dwarfed anything the world had seen. Yet in public memory, this logistical war is almost entirely absent. Wartime media celebrated frontline heroism, but rarely mentioned the armadas of cargo ships, oilers, and repair tenders that kept the war machine moving. The American advance across the Pacific was a triumph, not just of courage, but of organization. Each island captured had to be transformed into a forward base, complete with ports, hospitals, power stations, and airstrips, often within weeks. Naval construction battalions, known as Seabees, became the engineers of victory, building infrastructure in extreme conditions of heat, coral, and isolation. Their work extended thousands of miles, fuel depots in the Marshalls, docks at Saipan, and airfields on Tinian that would later launch B-29 bombers toward Japan. Behind them, the merchant marine sustained an oceanic supply chain of staggering complexity. Convoys carried oil from California, ammunition from Pennsylvania, and food from the Midwest across 6,000 miles of open water. A single fleet task force required millions of gallons of fuel each week. Without this constant flow, the island-hopping campaign would have ground to a halt within months. The Japanese high command never matched this scale of organization. Their shipping capacity collapsed under submarine blockade, while American fleets remained self-sustaining. Yet logistics carried its own cost: exhaustion, accidents, and invisibility. The men who kept the ships running, the engines fueled, and the food delivered often fought in anonymity, their service overshadowed by battles that could not have existed without them. The Pacific War was, in essence, a war of movement and maintenance. Understanding it through logistics reveals the quiet truth. Victory depended less on combat than on continuity, less on the clash of fleets than on the unbroken chain of supply that made those fleets possible. 9. The misconception of Japan's reluctance to surrender. A persistent belief holds that Japan refused all thought of surrender until the atomic bomb forced capitulation. The narrative implies a nation united in fanaticism, fighting to the last breath. Yet diplomatic archives and intercepted communications tell a different story. By early 1945, factions within Japan's government had already recognized the inevitability of defeat. The Imperial Navy was destroyed, cities lay in ruins, and industrial production had collapsed. Efforts to seek a negotiated peace through neutral intermediaries, including the Soviet Union and Sweden, were quietly initiated months before Hiroshima. These overtures sought to preserve the emperor's status, not to continue total war. American intelligence intercepted many of these messages, but viewed them skeptically, interpreting them as stalling tactics. The Allied demand for unconditional surrender left little room for negotiation, and Japan's divided leadership could not produce a unified proposal. The myth of total resistance arose later, simplified for clarity in the post-war narrative. It portrayed the atomic bomb as the singular event that broke an otherwise impenetrable will. In truth, Japan's collapse was cumulative. Firebombing raids had already destroyed Tokyo and dozens of other cities. The submarine blockade had starved the population, and morale within the armed forces had crumbled. What remained was political paralysis, not unanimous defiance. When the emperor finally intervened in August 1945 to accept surrender, he was not overturning a united nation, but resolving a deadlock among exhausted leaders. Understanding this nuance does not lessen the tragedy of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It clarifies that Japan's surrender was the endpoint of a process already underway, a convergence of military defeat, economic ruin, and political exhaustion. The myth of unyielding resistance obscures the deeper truth that by the summer of 1945, Japan was not a defiant empire, but a disintegrating one, waiting for a voice powerful enough to admit it. 10. The overlooked price of victory. The Pacific War ended with images of parades, headlines declaring peace, and ships returning to jubilant ports. For decades, public memory framed it as a triumph of courage and ingenuity, a necessary struggle that restored balance to the world. Yet the cost of that victory, both material and human, was rarely spoken of in full. Nearly 110,000 American servicemen were killed in the Pacific Theater, with hundreds of thousands more wounded or psychologically scarred. Entire fleets had been consumed by relentless operations, and the logistical apparatus that carried the war's weight left invisible scars on those who maintained it. Veterans of the island campaigns returned home to silence about what they had endured: the heat, the disease, the sights of annihilation that defied explanation. Ships that had sustained the fleet were scrapped within years, and the floating bases that enabled victory vanished from memory as quickly as they were dismantled. The industrial mobilization that built the Pacific war machine left behind vast surpluses of equipment and millions of demobilized workers suddenly without purpose. The Pacific itself bore the residue: sunken wrecks, unexploded ordnance, and devastated ecosystems. Even Japan's reconstruction, often celebrated as miraculous, unfolded atop ashes and hunger. The moral cost of total victory, civilian casualties from bombing campaigns, devastated societies, and the ushering in of nuclear warfare, was rarely examined in the immediate aftermath. America emerged stronger, but at a price measured not only in lives lost, but in lessons subdued. The Pacific War was not simply a narrative of liberation. It was an era that redefined the limits of endurance, organization, and destruction. To confront its full legacy is to recognize that victory did not erase the war's contradictions. It only buried them beneath celebration. What endures, after all records are studied and myths stripped away, is the simple truth that triumph in total war is never clean. It is built on sacrifice beyond measure and on truths too complex to fit into legend. History rarely tells everything, but what it leaves behind still defines us. The Pacific War was not only a story of victory, but of endurance, complexity, and the unseen machinery that sustained it. What remains are the traces of decisions made under uncertainty, lessons written in quiet consequence. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe and keep history remembered.